When a woman finds herself in trouble, her whole world turns upside down. Children become the essence of her existence, and her love for them is boundless. Sometimes men who can do harm don't understand the lengths a mother will go to when her child's well-being is at stake. In the town of Racine, Wisconsin, a 911 dispatcher received an unusual call. The female caller was mumbling something inaudible. At first, the operator did not take the call seriously, thinking it was a prank. However, despite the fact that the woman on the other end of the line was barely breathing, and her voice was gradually fading, she managed to relay extremely important information to the dispatcher, desperate to be taken seriously. When the police arrived at the address given, there was no one in the house. However, they found a large bloody stain on the living room carpet and an empty gun holster. Shortly thereafter, the man contacted emergency services. He reported that his wife Teri had disappeared and their 2 daughters were missing with her, leaving no leads. Background: let's go back to 1995. David Larson, a former Marine, seemed like a desirable husband. He worked as an air traffic controller and was a homeowner. However, Teri was attracted not by his property and stable job, but by his cheerful disposition. As they got to know each other better, they realized they had a lot in common. Both were passionate about starting a family and having children. In 1996, after a year of relationship, Teri Jandusa and David Larson got married. It seemed that a happy life together awaited them. In the following years, the family expanded. They became parents of 2 adorable daughters, Amanda and Holly, born 2 years apart. However, Teri soon realized that the real David is not as kind and wonderful as she thought he was. The first time he hit her was during their honeymoon in Hawaii. Shocked and deeply upset, Teri demanded an explanation. David stated that she was now his wife and had an obligation to obey her husband. At first, the woman thought it was the first quarrel of lovers and did not pay much attention to the incident. She remained in the relationship, hoping to correct Larson's rough temper. In the following years, the man completely subordinated his wife and often organized outbursts of violence. David was aggressive, such as once slamming Teri's head against a door. Every time he lost his temper or had a fit of rage, he tried to convince Teri that it was her fault and she needed to behave better. Then he would not be angry. The woman was genuinely afraid of what else he was capable of, so she did her best to calm her husband down, because even a minor detail could make him mad. David would yell at Teri if the curtains were hung just a little wrong or the towels folded incorrectly. He insisted she keep the bathroom door open when she showered or used the toilet. The woman was so afraid of her husband's violent reactions to minor mishaps, like a broken plate, that she got rid of anything compromising by throwing it in the neighbor's trash can. One day, David noticed a sausage burning in the pan and reprimanded his wife for wasting his money. During uncontrollable fits of rage, a terrified Teri often hid in the basement because she had nowhere else to hide. You see, David had installed locks on the doors between the rooms, and only he had the keys. Larson demanded absolute obedience from his wife. One day, as usual, Teri was preparing dinner when David came home and noticed a package of spaghetti on the table. For some unknown reason, this angered him, and he demanded that his wife remove the pasta immediately before it spoiled. Her arguments that dry pasta couldn't disappear that quickly only added fuel to the fire. David stated that she should follow his instructions rather than argue. At that moment, Teri was holding their 2-month-old baby in her arms, but even that didn't stop an enraged David, and he roughly pushed his wife. The baby cried, and the woman wondered again if she wanted that kind of life for her daughters. Then she decided that she would do everything she could to keep her children away from their tyrannical father. Teri vowed to herself that she would leave this relationship no matter what it cost her. She tolerated the abuse from her husband, believing deep down inside that the problem was herself, that she was somehow misbehaving. But once she sensed that David might be a danger to the children, Teri fully realized that he was the source of the problem. Determined to protect her daughters, she packed up while her husband was away, took the children, and found temporary refuge in a domestic violence shelter. Shortly thereafter, in November 1999, she filed for divorce, but Larson used every means available to delay the process. As a result, their marriage was not dissolved until January 31st, 2001. It seemed that the situation was finally resolved, but for Teri it turned into a new nightmare. A judge granted her and David joint custody of the children, despite the fact that he had been abusive to his wife. Now she had to let him see Amanda and Holly. On the courthouse steps the day the divorce was essentially finalized, David leaned over to his ex-wife and looked her in the eye and whispered angrily that she would regret what she had done. Teri had escaped after years of abuse and violence, but the danger was not over. She worried about the girls every time she had to let them go to their father's house for the weekend. David's threats echoed constantly in her head, and she was scared to trust him with the children. Larson continued to verbally and physically abuse Teri whenever she brought or took their daughters. Because of this, she had to demand that they hand the children over in public places. Twice she had to call the police to safely leave her ex-husband's home, and she eventually secured a warrant for his arrest for stalking. Peace of mind didn't come until 3 years later when Teri met Nick-Nicolai. In him, she found the support and comfort she had been missing. The woman began to trust people again and open up to them. She and Nick fell in love, and he surrounded her with the care and attention she deserved. They soon became a happy family, and Nick treated the girls as his own children. In 2003, Nick and Teri were married. It seemed like it should have been a time of joy and happiness. However, Teri soon discovered that her ex-husband was not ready to let her go. David told acquaintances that she would regret the day she decided to marry Nick. He believed that in his eyes and God's eyes they were still married, so by remarrying, Teri had gone against God's will. He kept memorabilia from their wedding, including Teri's dress, photo albums, and videotapes, which he showed to his daughters as proof that their mother had not kept her promises. Unable to further control his ex-wife's life, Larson plotted something terrible. On January 31st, 2004, the third anniversary of Teri and David's divorce, the woman had no idea that her worst fears would soon materialize. She was going to Larson's that day to pick up her daughters, 6-year-old Amanda and 4-year-old Holly, after their next visit with their father. As time passed, despite the protective order, Teri became increasingly relaxed as her ex-husband tried to keep a low profile. Nick-Nicolai offered to keep her company, but Teri was still wary of David's reaction and decided that her new husband's presence would only complicate things, so she went alone. Larson had a temper, and she wanted to do her best to keep him from snapping in front of the girls. Although she was about to meet her former abusive husband, Teri was in high spirits. Having missed her daughters, she couldn't wait to see them and share important family news. She was sure the girls would love it. It was a beautiful, frosty morning. She and Nick had learned the night before that Teri was pregnant, so the couple was over the moon. The happy mother couldn't wait to tell her daughters that they were about to have a brother or sister. At exactly 10 a.m., Teri walked up to Larson's house and knocked on the door. The man opened, and she thought his mood was better than usual this time. David said the girls were playing hide-and-seek and wanted their mom to find them. Although her intuition told Teri that something was wrong with him, she went inside. At that moment, she experienced a strange feeling that something fishy was going on here. When Teri turned to Larson in bewilderment, he reminded her that she had once accused him of being cruel, even though it wasn't true. But now she would fully understand what it means when your husband beats you. Teri didn't even have time to respond before David picked up a baseball bat that was standing nearby, and everything went dark after that. When consciousness returned to her, she found herself lying on the floor of her ex-husband's living room. My head ached unbearably, as if it had been hit several times with something heavy. Blood was trickling from her ear, and her body seemed paralyzed. Before Teri could try to move and realize what had happened, David had wrapped duct tape around her and then began to squeeze her throat with his hands. The first thought that came to her mind was, where are the girls? She couldn't give up until she knew they were okay. Teri remembered from the movie how to defend yourself when you're being strangled. She turned her head to the side and began to pray. David was losing his grip, frustrated that he couldn't get rid of his ex-wife so easily, and began to lose his temper. Teri fought back as hard as she could, but the effects of the blows to her head took their toll and she lost too much blood. To her horror, she realized that even if given the chance, she still wouldn't be able to escape. Her mind worked feverishly while Larson tried unsuccessfully to strangle Teri, carried her outside and threw her into a dumpster, then closed the lid. He sprinkled snow and ice to cover his tracks. Teri could hear him sealing the container with duct tape to permanently lock her inside. David then dragged the dumpster to the truck and covered it with a tarp to camouflage it. Meanwhile, Teri desperately searched for a way to get out, realizing that he might dump her in the woods, shoot her, or try to get rid of her in some other way. Apparently, he refrained from shooting inside the house so as not to attract the attention of the neighbors. But Teri's main concern was not her own life. She was afraid that if David could get away with killing her, he would get sole custody of her daughters. But even scarier was that he might hurt the girls after she disappeared. Who knows what goes on in that monster's head? Teri was shivering from the cold. Her thoughts were confused. There was no way she could figure out how to run. The car was bouncing on the bumps. Larson was probably in a hurry to complete his evil deed. Suddenly, at one point, the container shook so violently that Teri hit the wall, and it came to her. David had been so sure that everything would go smoothly that he had made a huge mistake. He hadn't noticed that she still had her cell phone in her jacket pocket. The thawing snow had loosened the sticky tape on her body slightly, and Teri managed to reach into her pocket and fumble for the phone's buttons. She could barely utter a few words, but for some reason the 911 operator was skeptical of the call, thinking it was some kind of joke. The captive didn't have the energy or time to explain what had happened. She only managed to say she was on the verge of death and dictate the name and address of her captor. Teri didn't know where her ex-husband intended to take her, and she couldn't remember how much charge was left in her phone. She wanted to call her husband Nick one more time to inform him of the situation and say goodbye. Unlike the 911 operator, Nick didn't delay. He immediately realized what was going on. The man didn't talk for too long so as not to drain the battery of his wife's cell phone, which could have been her only means of escape. He told her he loved her and said goodbye, wondering if this was the last time he would hear Teri's voice. In a panic, Nick immediately called the police and reported that his wife was missing. He also reported that David Larson had taken their 2 daughters away for the weekend, and now the girls were also missing. The police had gotten a lead on the 3 missing people, and now they were faced with a race against time to quickly find the missing mother and her 2 daughters. They already knew that Teri was being held against her will, but they didn't know where her children had been all this time or if they were in danger. At this point, a patrol car was dispatched to David Larson's address. Meanwhile, trapped in an icy dumpster in the back of her ex-husband's pickup truck, Teri felt she could pass out from blood loss at any moment. If Larson drove into the nearest woods, the police might never find her, so she started pushing the tank lid from the inside, trying to break free, but the tape wouldn't budge. She managed to stick her arm through the outside, which gave her a small chance of escape if someone spotted her. Teri began waving desperately, hoping that passing pedestrians or cars would notice her. But before anyone could see her, a movement in the back of the truck caught David's attention. He glanced in the rearview mirror and immediately realized what was happening. He pulled off to the side of the road and climbed out of the cab and into the back of the pickup. With all his might, he kicked the container and threatened to take Teri's life right there if she didn't calm down. He was about to get back in the driver's seat when something unexpected happened. Suddenly, Teri's cell phone rang and her heart sank. It was her only chance for salvation. Trying to quickly silence the ringing or drop the call, the woman picked at the phone with her frozen fingers to no avail. Unfortunately, David heard the ringtone. He ripped off the lid of the container and snatched the cell phone from the captive woman's hands. Resealing the garbage can with duct tape, he returned to the cab and continued on his way. Inside, Teri was still carrying her tiny unborn child, and her 2 daughters in need of care were somewhere unknown, with no way to save her. She couldn't even cry at that moment, but her thoughts were interrupted by the howl of approaching police sirens. Teri knew they were on their way to rescue her, but to her great disappointment, the patrol car sped past at full speed and the sounds faded into the distance. The cops weren't looking for the pickup at that moment. They were speeding toward David Larson's house. It never occurred to the officers that they had just rushed past a woman who had called 911 and was locked in a dumpster. The captive woman felt completely helpless. The moment the sirens died down, she sat in the filthy container, exhausted, realizing she was about to lose everything: her daughters, Nick, her unborn child, and her seemingly happy life. When police arrived on the scene, they kicked down the door but found no one inside. In the living room, officers noticed a large bloody stain on the carpet and an empty gun holster. Neither the girls, their mother, nor the homeowner were inside. While looking through the rooms, the officers noticed that all the walls in the house were hung with pictures from David and Teri's life together. During the search, they also found women's athletic pants with remnants of duct tape wrapped around the ankles. The tape showed traces of a red substance that looked like blood. They interviewed neighbors who said they saw David tow Teri's car this morning. The detectives realized that they only had a few hours, and if the perpetrator didn't take down Teri immediately, he could have headed elsewhere to finish what he had started. The cops weren't going to waste a second until they found the mother and her children alive and unharmed. Forensics tried to track David and Teri's cell phones. They were able to pick up Larson's cell phone signal in Milwaukee, about a half-hour drive from his home. But then the signal disappeared. In addition, detectives found real estate deeds in Milwaukee. 3 different addresses were listed there, and police checked each of those buildings. Near one of the properties, they found Teri Jandusa-Nicolai's car. They figured that David had tried to get rid of the car, but may have left evidence inside indicating the future direction he was headed. However, there was nothing in the car, and there was no sign of the recent presence of the children or their mother. At other properties owned by Larson, police found no leads either. Time was running out, and the lives of the abductees could have been cut short at any moment. Nick Nicolai, Teri's second husband, was distraught. He could not calm down and blamed himself for letting his pregnant wife go to this monster. But he was even more concerned about the fate of the girls, for whom he had already become fond. At the same time, the police were searching for any evidence, interviewing relatives and friends. The Amber Alert system has been activated for child abduction cases in the United States. Nearly 100 law enforcement officers investigated various leads in the case. The volunteers, some of whom had never met Teri, spent the day driving around city neighborhoods and searching the basements of unfinished homes for any sign of her presence. What was their surprise when David Larson showed up for his job as an air traffic controller in the evening, acting as if nothing had happened. He arrived in the very green pickup truck that the police had been looking for on the APB, and he was immediately brought in for questioning. The man told detectives that he was shocked by Teri's disappearance and was willing to do whatever he could to help find her. Investigators at first pretended to believe his words. However, as David insisted that his ex-wife never showed up to pick up the girls, his lies became more and more obvious. Larson claimed he had spent the entire morning at home, unaware that his cell phone had been picked up in Milwaukee. But when detectives told him that a police squad had visited his home around 11:30 a.m., kicked in the door looking for Teri, and found her bloody clothes with tape on her pant leg, David became visibly nervous. He began fidgeting in his chair and rubbing his pants nervously with his hands. At that moment, the detective noticed dark stains on his clothes and directly accused Larson of lying, saying there was blood on his jeans. David began to hesitate, and his story suddenly changed. He admitted that Teri had indeed come to his house that morning, but he hadn't noticed her at first. Like a good father, Larson packed his daughter's school supplies into their backpacks with his back to the front door. Teri entered noiselessly. When the man turned around, he saw his ex-wife with her face contorted with rage and a hammer cocked above her head. The pressure mounted and David's excuses became increasingly ridiculous. He then explained to the police that he had been shocked by his ex-wife's strange behavior. She had snuck into his house and seemed ready to attack him from behind with a hammer, so he had to do whatever was necessary to defend himself. Fearing for his life, he said, he grabbed a nearby baseball bat and hit Teri in the face with it as hard as he could. David then took the duct tape, but he doesn't understand why, and everything that happened that morning remains a blur to him. Naturally, the detectives didn't believe a word of Larson's self-defense story, but they had to listen to him in the hope that he would talk his way out of it. They interrogated him for hours, but he never revealed anything that could help find Teri Jandusa-Nicolai. Eventually, investigators were able to get David to talk about where the children were. He blurted out that he had taken them to a babysitter's house. Armed with information about the girl's whereabouts, police officers promptly dispatched a unit to the address. Following this single lead, the officers cautiously approached the house. It turned out that David hadn't lied this time. Both girls were safe at that address. The police officers breathed a sigh of relief to find the children unharmed. It was a significant breakthrough in the case. However, Holly and Amanda did not see their mother that day. And although David revealed the location where the children were, he still hadn't said a word about where Teri might have been. So detectives confiscated his personal belongings, such as his wallet and clothing. In the wallet, they found business cards from various organizations and a bunch of checks. The cops started calling all the phone numbers listed, but they had no luck until they came across a business card that caught their attention. It was a business card for a storage facility in Wheeling, Illinois. When they called the number listed, the receptionist informed them that David Larson did indeed rent a storage unit there. Moreover, he had been there just yesterday. Finally, police thought they knew where to look for the missing woman. By then, 27 hours had passed since Teri Jandusa had disappeared. Detectives realized there was not a second to lose. They rushed there at full speed, still hoping to find the captive alive. Arriving at the warehouses with the help of a security guard, they found the right room. When the police officers went inside, it was dark and very cold. They began calling Teri's name loudly, hoping that she would somehow respond. However, the building was still ominously silent. The detectives used a crowbar to break the lock on one of the storage rooms. Various boxes and plastic containers were scattered on the floor, most of which were covered in a layer of dust. Shining flashlights around, ready to leave, the detectives noticed a garbage can with the lid screwed on in the corner behind some shelving. Next to it lay a two-tone baseball bat, the handle painted wood, the tip blackened and stained with what looked like dried blood. A chill ran down the detectives' spines. They desperately hoped to find Teri alive. Let's go back a bit and find out what really happened to the woman after the police car raced past with sirens blaring. The sounds of the sirens faded into the distance, and Teri lost her last hope of escape. At that moment, all she could think about was what her ex-husband might have done to the girls. Time seemed to slip away from her. It seemed like an eternity since she had entered the Larson home that morning. Suddenly, the truck stopped, and Teri heard her daughter's voices outside. The girls were somewhere nearby, running and laughing. Teri's first impulse was to make a fuss and get Amanda and Holly's attention, but she quickly pushed that thought away. First of all, they were so young they wouldn't be able to do anything, and secondly, she didn't want to traumatize them further. Even on the brink of death, Teri thought only of protecting her children. At that moment, she made the heartbreaking decision to remain silent. Hearing her daughter's laughter and play, Teri realized that they had not been harmed and were okay. If the children found out that their father had attacked their mother, it would only put them at even greater risk. David could turn his anger on them, and Teri desperately wanted to shield Amanda and Holly from that. Then the truck started up again, and they drove to another location. The next thing Teri felt was the dumpster being lowered to the ground. All she heard was something heavy being placed on top of it. She was silent the whole time, wishing her ex-husband believed she was dead and not using any weapons. She was trapped in this icy tomb and wondered what would happen next. Would David try to finish her off or leave her to die here? Teri's musings were interrupted by the sound of the door closing, and then all was quiet. She was left all alone in the airtight plastic container, curled up in a ball. Everyone she loved was left behind, and there was no chance of escape. After waiting a few minutes, she made sure Larson was gone and hadn't set a trap. Teri began screaming and begging for help as loudly as her horse's voice and running out oxygen would allow. She pressed herself against the walls of the container, trying to open the lid and scratching her legs in the process. But she managed to lift the lid enough that she was able to breathe in some air. Teri was finally able to breathe easier, but due to her injuries and the low temperature, she quickly lost consciousness. With each passing hour, the situation worsened. It was cold where the dumpster stood, and Teri's body was still covered in snow. It was no longer melting because her body temperature was dropping rapidly. Her arms ached and her legs were numb from the cold. Teri tried to put her hands down to rub her toes a little, but her body wouldn't budge. Her eyelids slowly began to droop. She desperately wanted to rest, talking herself into believing it was only a moment, but immediately snapped out of her seat and rubbed her eyes vigorously. Underscore, 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 underscore. She knew that falling asleep was a death sentence. The wound on her head was still bleeding and throbbing terribly. Teri was already so exhausted that eternal sleep seemed the best option for her. Unfortunately, she had lost too much strength to get out of the dumpster, and now she had given up hope that anyone would find her. She didn't even know where David had left her, but there was one thing that kept the spark of life alive in her. If she died, who would protect her children? Fear for her baby still gave her the strength not to give up, and the adrenaline in her bloodstream helped her fight the urge to sleep. Teri drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes delirious, and then she heard a noise. Her first thought was that David had returned. Panic instantly seized her mind. She didn't understand what he was going to do next, shoot her because she was still alive, or throw the trash can into the lake. Teri tried to remain calm, not to make a sound, hoping he would leave, but the footsteps were getting closer. It had been over 24 hours since Teri Jandusa-Nicolai had disappeared. While checking a warehouse belonging to her ex-husband, David Larson, the cops noticed a dumpster in the far corner. They removed all the weights from it, cut the foil, and opened the lid. When they looked inside, they couldn't believe what they saw. There was a woman lying inside in the fetal position. There was a huge wound on her head. Her eyelids were swollen and her face was purple. Her toes were blackened with frostbite, and it looked like she had put socks on them. Her appearance was horrifying. Teri had been beaten, tied up, and left to die in an icy dumpster. But miraculously, she was still clinging to life, breathing and able to speak. Detectives, who have seen a lot in their careers, witnessed something like this for the first time. The cops feared they would do more harm if they tried to remove the woman from the dumpster, so they left her there until the ambulance arrived. It was winter outside, and it was a freezing day. Even breathing was painful outdoors, so there was no guarantee that the joy wouldn't be premature. The survivor found in the dumpster could leave this world at any moment. Teri was rushed to the hospital. David had beaten her with a baseball bat, and she spent nearly 27 hours in the snow and ice. Her body temperature was critically low, but she continued to fight for her life. After coming to her senses, the first thing Teri did was ask where her children were. They explained that the girls were alive and well, and David Larson was in jail. A wave of relief swept over her. She knew now that the fight had been worth it. Teri's husband, Nick, was overjoyed when he got the call from the police with the news about his wife. The man burst into tears. It was the best phone call of his life. Nick rushed to the hospital where his pregnant wife had been taken just a couple minutes before. Despite all the good news, Teri and Nick faced a tragic loss. The baby that had been growing in her womb for weeks was no longer viable because of what she'd been through. Teri couldn't leave the child she so desperately wanted to tell her daughters about, and her marriage to Nick began in ways they never dreamed possible. But Teri did her best to focus on the positives. She was still alive. Her children were safe, and she was loved and cherished. Even though she had to have her toes amputated because of frostbite, she felt almost relieved. At first, the doctors thought hypothermia would necessitate the amputation of her legs and arms, to amputate her legs and arms up to the elbows. However, Teri was able to recover quickly, and they did not have to resort to such drastic measures. The doctors estimated she had only 1 hour to live before she would have died, and it was a real miracle that the police found her in time. Teri spent almost 7 weeks in the hospital, underwent 10 different surgeries, and even after she returned home, she remained confined to a wheelchair for weeks. She was angry that she could no longer run or climb stairs on her own, to put her girls to bed. But she was grateful that she and her daughters were alive and would never see David again. After a long recovery, Teri had to go to court to confront her abductor again. She suffered emotional trauma all over again, not only from being trapped in a dumpster for over 24 hours, but also the loss of her unborn child with Nick. Larson's attorneys tried to find evidence that the loss of the unborn child could have occurred naturally and not as a result of her ex-husband's actions. Despite hundreds of undisputed pieces of evidence pointing to David's guilt, the defense wanted to see Teri's medical records for her entire life, and she had to fight again to hold her abuser accountable and put him behind bars. At the federal level, David Larson was sentenced to life in prison. Teri and her family were finally safe. After the verdict was announced, he glared angrily at the woman who, until recently, had been completely under his control. But she knew that her ex-husband could never again hurt her or those she loved. She would never let anyone else control her life.